Well, hi folks, this is Dr. Duncan, resuming our introduction to climate and biodiversity and biomes in particular. And this is the beginning of part 3 of our Unit 5 for the course. And we just got through looking at precipitation zones and also dry zones across the planet and how this is caused by these climate circulation cells that we have through the atmosphere. So what about Alabama? What do we have in terms of Alabama's variation in climate zones? Well, um, I want to first introduce you to a term that's called a biome. A biome is a large region of land characterized by having a similar climate and ecosystems, usually similar animal and plant communities as well. And here I've got pictured a couple different and very divergent biomes here. You've got a desert biome, and on the right you have a rainforest biome. Now, it's important to note that this is the largest scale, or the next largest scale above ecosystem. So if you look out in that rainforest biome, you're going to have a different type of ecosystem on the stream valley bottoms than you're going to have up on the ridges, and a different variation that'll be on those hill slopes. So even though you've got ecosystem variation there, it's all part of the same biome because they share these similar characteristics in terms of that case, high rainfall, hot temperatures, and lush growth of forest. Biomes tend to be distributed across the planet based on climate, and that tends to be the biggest influence for what types of biomes you have and where you have them. And if you were to take a transect from or follow a path from the North Pole to the equator, you would cross through some biomes fairly predictably, regardless of where you started. Up at the pole, you'd have polar ice. If it's the North Pole, of course, that's sea ice in the winter, whereas Antarctica's ice covered year round. You go, just speaking the northern hemisphere here, heading south, you hit a type of biome called the tundra, where the vegetation's very short. You don't have any trees. It's just small plants that have a very short growing season. This is where you've seen pictures of reindeer herds and Arctic foxes and other animals like that you find in far northern Alaska. To the south of that, it gets sufficiently warm with enough rainfall that you get a forest that's called a taiga. These are arboreal forests, as another name for them. They're dominated by conifer trees, spruce and fir, and a few others. And they stretch all the way around like a circle around the northern hemisphere. South of that, you get into forests more like what we have here in Alabama, the temperate forests. These are forests that are influenced by the changing seasons still, usually broadleaf species as opposed to needle species being the dominant trees in the canopy. And then farther still to the south, once you get into the tropics, you start to get into rainforests. And of course, there's different types of rainforests and different biomes within the tropics, but we're not going to get into that here. Now, these are some generalities about Alabama, and that is that we have a temperate deciduous forest as our background default biome type. But in reality, we've actually got a couple other biomes represented. We've got some temperate evergreen forests. These would be our longleaf pine woodlands. And we've even got some temperate grassland biome represented in the state with our blackland prairie. Now, if we look at the biome patterns across the planet, we would find that they hold on, or they present some pretty regular patterns, but there's also variation. We're going to look at those patterns first, and then look at the exceptions. So, on this map, you'll see that purple color. We'll take that to start with. Those are those northern boreal forests, those taiga forests. And you see that they form a pretty clear band across the top of North America and Europe and Asia. Above that, that light blue is your tundra zone. Below the taiga, you start to get a whole mishmash of biomes, everything from temperate deciduous forests to grasslands and steppe and a few others thrown in there. But if you kind of zoom out and look at the big picture, you'll still see that there are these patterns that are arranged along the latitudes of the planet. So, for example, check out the tropical rainforest, that bright green. They, of course, are found mostly along where the equator is. Check out our deserts also. That's the lighter yellow and orange colors. You'll see that you got the deserts of the western U.S., you've got the northern Africa and, and East Asia deserts, the Middle East, and then in the southern hemisphere you've got South Africa and Australia and parts of South America. So those are the general trends. They tend to follow those climate zones that we looked at a few slides ago. However, you'll also notice that there's a lot of variation. Notice, for example, that the tropical rainforests of Asia extend farther north than the tropics extend. You'll also notice similar patterns with deserts in Central Asia going farther north than they would according to what we'd expect if all the bands were aligned following those temperature bands that we saw on the planet a few slides back. And check out Alabama. At Alabama's latitude, we would expect to find deserts, but we don't. So that begs a question. Why isn't Alabama a desert? Everywhere, not everywhere, but most other places on the planet at Alabama's latitude, you've got very dry conditions, but Alabama is an exception. So what's going on here? Well, a couple things are influencing Alabama and why we have that. One of which is the fact that we've got the Gulf of Mexico right at our doorstep. And that's the first of 4 different mechanisms that wind up causing regional climate variation. And so we'll start off, we're going to talk in a few minutes about currents and then monsoons, and we'll talk about rain shadows and elevational temperature gradients as well. The 2 that I have highlighted here in orange are the 2 that have the most influence on Alabama's climate variation, the presence of currents and the monsoons. Okay, so let's start off with currents. Remember when in the part 1 of this presentation, I talked about how water is very lazy. It's very slow to absorb heat, and then once it has it, it doesn't want to let it go. So consequently, as the major currents of the planet distribute water around, it winds up delivering heat to areas that would otherwise be cold. One of the more famous of these effects is the fact that that Great Britain and parts of northwestern Europe are much warmer than they would be they're much warmer than our other latitudes, they're much warmer than other places at the same latitude. So if you go east or west from Great Britain and Western Europe, you're going to get in some very cold areas. They're significantly colder than Great Britain is. And that's because we've got this current that comes up from the Atlantic. You see here with that red arrow, comes up through the Atlantic and brings warm tropical waters and bathes northwestern Europe with warm tropical waters all year long. They're not warm and tropical by the time they get there, but they're still delivering a lot of heat and causing variation from what you would expect otherwise. So the closer a spot is to the coast, then the stronger is the effect of these oceans and the currents in influencing local climate variation. Now let's take a look at Alabama's doorstep down here in the Gulf of Mexico. And what we see is that there is a current that comes up from the Caribbean Ocean. It's called the loop current. It's called the loop current because it makes this nice little loop that then travels out through the Florida Straits and joins the Gulf Stream that heads up towards Europe. This means that all year long that tropical waters are being delivered to the areas just below or just south of South Alabama. That brings a lot of heat to the Gulf states, but it also brings a lot of moisture. The reason it brings moisture is that that warm water likes to evaporate. And that means a lot of water vapor accumulates in the lower atmosphere, and it's brought into the areas near the coast, but also areas far back away from the coast. You've probably noticed on maps of the U.S. that the eastern U.S. is very green compared to the west. Well, that's because of its higher rainfall. Well, it's been estimated that about 50% of the rain falling in the eastern U.S. is water that had just recently evaporated from the Gulf of Mexico in the matter of, in some cases, hours, or at most a day or so, a couple days. So we've got the loop current and the Gulf of Mexico bringing both heat and water vapor to the southeast. And this bathes Alabama in a lot of moisture and a little bit of extra heat during the winter, keeping things mild. And that's the reason why Alabama is not a desert. Okay, here we're looking at annual average precipitation in the U.S., and you can see these patterns on a broader scale. What you see with the green color here is areas with higher rainfall than colors that are red. There's two regions in the U.S. that receive a lot of precipitation. One is the southeast, and the other is the Pacific Northwest. Alabama is at the very center of this region of high rainfall in the southeast. And this gives Alabama, compared to other states throughout the rest of the U.S., this gives Alabama an advantage in terms of its biodiversity, because all this, the heat that it has plus all this rainfall means that it gets, its ecosystems are very productive. The Pacific Northwest, which also gets a lot of rain, is much colder, and so its ecosystems are not as productive, and they don't sustain as many species as we have in the southeastern states.